Before we get into assessments in a lot of detail, which I'm really excited about talking about, could you tell us a little bit about the job interview? I know recently you've had some articles about, what if the job interview was dead? So can you tell us a little bit about that?
When job interviews are conducted well, they're really valuable. When you have somebody who's well trained, who has a good clinical eye, who can see beyond the obvious answers, and who has a very, very well-structured, predefined guide of questions. All candidates go through the same questions, and you have almost like an algorithmic scoring key to interpret what they say and understand what that means. When all that happens, we know the data are very clear. Interviews predict performance really well. The problem is most of the time that doesn't happen, and what you have is people who are not properly trained. They see it as a kind of spontaneous social interaction with people. Not all candidates go through the same questions, and it's very hard for interviews to ignore irrelevant stuff. All the recent discussion on unconscious bias, for example, well, most people are actually conscious of their biases, but they can't just suddenly suppress the fact that they have a woman in front of them, or a man, or an ethnic minority, or somebody old or young. Even if you try, you can't ignore stuff that is there. That's why interviews have so many limitations, and more often than not, they just add noise and confusion to the process, which means if we killed the average job interview, we wouldn't lose that much.
So what are the limitations of the human brain?
We are pre-wired, or our way brains are constructed to pick up information in a very holistic way, right? So right now I'm talking to you, but I can't ignore the fact that there are cameras there and the light is on, etc. Then I'm very affected by your nonverbal communication. And that might be useful if I'm interested in seeing whether there's chemistry, or whether, there's some kind of a gut instinct that tells me I should trust you or not. But more often than not, those signs or signals have nothing to do with your performance later on. And then I think, I find it quite interesting that people talk a lot about culture fit, right? So, I have such a great feeling about this candidate because we got on well, we have the same interests, values, and there's not much difference between hiring on culture fit or unconscious bias and perpetuating the kind of stereotypes or the preferences that you have. Again, so we focus a lot, our brains pick up a lot of things that are irrelevant, and they ignore stuff that is really important. What happens in an interview is generally very different from what happens when a person is on the job later on.
That's so reinforced by my experience, because my experience when I've had candidates come into interview, and I'll ask the interviewer, what did you think? The first thing is, really liked them.
Yeah.
And I'll be, what do you think they can do for the company? And then they stumble a little bit. They can't actually articulate it because they spent so much time with the interview seeing if they relate to them as a human being,
yeah,
versus what is their potential and what can they do,
yeah,
for the company to drive performance.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that makes everything even worse or exacerbates the problem is that we then don't have objective data to test whether we were right or not, right? Because so often the person who decides to hire the candidate or not during the interview is later on tasked with evaluating their performance. So first of all, if you like them during the interview, you will probably like them 3 months or 3 years later. Secondly, if you notice that they're not that good, you won't admit that you made a mistake. And then, there's all sorts of biases like confirmation biases. If you like the person, you will only pay attention to the good things they do and ignore the bad things they do later on, and so forth. So often the unreliability or inaccuracy of the interview is hidden underneath the politics and the lack of data that we have later on, which makes the problem worse.
Well, and it gets reinforced even because when you do references, when you go to hire, usually they give references of people who already like them, and so whatever you want to find out on the candidate gets reinforced as well.
Yeah.
So it's just a kind of a vicious
cycle.
Vicious cycle that hopefully assessments can help us break.
I mean, ultimately, I think just like you probably wouldn't marry somebody on the basis of a first date or a 20-minute conversation or a 2-hour conversation. Most people don't, and those who do, it doesn't end up very well. You shouldn't offer somebody a long-term job based on a 1 or 2 hour discussion with them. It's just not good enough.
So that brings up another question that I hear over and over again from leaders. Is it possible to fake in a job interview. So you can fake my personality. I can come into the interview and really put it on and show that I'm really extroverted for a sales job, when in fact I might be extremely introverted. Is that possible to fake it?
Absolutely. And, the question isn't so much whether you're being authentic or truthful to yourself, but whether the signals or the behaviors that we see during an interview actually predict future job performance. This is why you need to design interviews really, really well. If they are understood as just some kind of ice-breaking, conversational, social event where we just let our gut feel tell us whether we like a person or not, it's going to be a disaster. You need to plan them really, really well, have them structured, standardized, and be ready to interpret everything people say in the context of their future performance.
And I can see why that could be helpful, because I don't know how many times I'm in an interview and you ask a question and you get the answer is on the internet.
But, a typical example would be if I ask you during an interview, do you enjoy working with others? Mm-hmm. Of course, you should say yes.
Exactly.
Because that means you understood the meaning of that question, and you probably know that it's a socially desirable thing to pretend, at least, to work with others. So you might be lying, but that lie is probably indicative that you're a good team player. Whereas if you say, actually, I don't like people, and most of the people, then you're being honest, you're not faking, but we don't want you for the job.